Hello friends, welcome to JavaEE EJB JPA tutorial. Now you are watching part 4 of the subseries JPA entity relation. So in this subseries we are exploring the one-to-one relation. In the previous video we created an entity called location entity. Now we will modify our savings account entity and we will perform the mapping. Here you will learn what is one-to-one annotation and its attributes. Then you will learn what is source and target entities. So source and target entities in the sense in entity point of view, which one is the source and which entity is the target. So those stuff we will learn here. These are all the prerequisites. We kept something as optional and something is required. And if you have prior knowledge, say for example here we specified 09 is required, so this is 09, this tutorial is required. That means you need to know, or you should set up a database connection with the Wildfly environment. This one is optional, but if you skip this you may not be able to access the JPA tool for Eclipse, because that requires connection to the target database. So this is a continuing subseries. That means in subseries 3 we created the entity project. In subseries 4 we learned how to perform create, update, delete operation on the entity. We also looked at the state changes. Then in subseries 5 we learned about the entity manager's merge method. In subseries 6 we learned how to use JPA and we also created our search form to search the savings account by means of ID, by means of account holder name, as well as the balance value. So here in this subseries we are learning the one-to-one relation, and in the downloadable code you can see the sample with the code snippet 7.xyz. And in the same file, if you see 3.6 for example, that means that piece of code is added as part of subseries 3 and code snippet is 6. Likewise, you have to read the code. So here 7.123 notation we will follow. Alright. So these are all the slide decks from the previous 3 parts. You can have a quick preview. I mean, not preview, quick review. So in this subseries we are concentrating about unidirectional relation. Next we created the DB script. We made adjustment to the savings account table to add a new database field. Then we created the location table. So in the previous video we created location entity. We also synchronized this location entity with our persistent unit in the previous video. So By this time, our persistent unit knows that it is managing two entities. One is location and another one is a savings account. And it also knows where those entities are pointing in the database. So the one-to-one annotation is used to define the one-to-one mapping between two entities. That means this is the annotation we will use. Remember the other annotations as well. @entity that tells a specific class is an entity class. We declare that before the class definition. Next, we provide @table. That one is to map the entity to a specific table in the database. Next, we learned about the @ID, @generated value, @column, all those stuff. Now we are introducing one more annotation, @one-to-one. In JPA one-to-one mapping, source will be the owner. So source will be the owner of the mapping and it maps to the non-owning entity. So this non-owning entity will be the target. So in our case, the savings account will be the source because that's where we are going to add this relation one-to-one. So savings account will be the owner. Since the savings account will be the owner because of one-to-one annotation, we can call that as the source entity, which will point to the location entity, and we can call that as a target entity or the non-owning entity. So in our example, source is the saving account entity and the target is the location entity. We will have the containment of location entity in the savings account. Savings account will hold the instance of location. So thereby the savings account will establish the relationship between the DB table savings AC pointing to a location record in the location table. So have a look at the annotation below. Here, if you see the very first thing, what you have to note is we are adding a field to our savings account and the field type is location. The entity persistence unit knows that there are two entities it is managing. One is a savings account and another one is location. So it knows that this location is an entity and that location is placed inside other entity and that entity name is a savings account. So the savings account points to savings AC database table and this location points to a location table in the database. Next comes the join column. We usually specify the column name by means of @column annotation. But here if you see, we are marking this location LOC with an annotation @join column. We are telling that it's a join column. Then we specify name as location ID. So location ID. So this join column signifies that when the entity manager is loading this savings account, it will not load the value in this LOC ID. So in the LOC ID at the database level, say for example, we are having a value 2 and in the location table there may be multiple rows and some row will hold a value 2, then street and city. So here we won't store 2. Instead, what happens, the join column tells that it is a joining column, so they go and scan the specific record, load that entity and store it here. So that's the significance of join column. Then here we are specifying that this location is following the one-to-one annotation. That means when there is a ID here and in the target, so this is the source, right? Savings account. So in entity terms, source is savings account and target is the location. So one-to-one source is savings account. Here we specify cascade equal to CascadeType all. So there are multiple CascadeType available. One is persist, remove or delete, merge, then the combination of all these CascadeType. So persist means when we persist saving account, it will cascade the effect. Suppose if we say 2, then it will go ahead and persist the location record also. Similarly, when we delete something in the savings account, based on this ID, it will go and scan the mapped row in the location table and deletes that. Merge, we know the merge method of entity manager will perform the state change, like it converts the managed entity to unmanaged entity into managed entity. So when such a state change happens, it will get cascaded to the pointed column as well. So this is the record, right? Pointed column in the sense here location ID, its pointed column is ID and the entire record. So entire record means here based on 2 it will pick it, then it applies the cascading effect for merge. That means if the record was previously in unmanaged state, the record becomes a managed one, because the source becomes managed, target also will become managed. So usually most of the developers will use the cascading effect of all. That means a combination of all these 3. So when something happens here for the source, then the same effect will get cascaded to the target entity. So that's all the significance. First we state there is a field or a data member. For in plain Java perspective, location is the data member for the savings account. Then we annotate it, stating it follows a one-to-one relation with the cascade type of all effect. Then we state that the join column for this is location ID. So in the savings account, use the location ID column to load location entity and store the loaded entities instance here. For example, let's state that our search form which we created in our previous subseries, let's say user is providing a ID in the text box, then they are performing the search. Let's say they provide ID as 2. So what happens, the entity manager, when it is loading the record using the JPA query or using the find method, it loads the savings account and it populates the field. Here ID is a person ID 2. Then let's take person name is N1. Then balance sum 1000. And here, for example, this 2 is for location ID. So it won't load 2 here. Instead, it makes use of this join column. Join column name is a location ID, right? Then it makes use of this location. So the persistent unit knows that it is managing 2 entities at this moment. One is the savings account and another one is location. So it knows it goes to the it needs to load the location entity, and location entity is pointing to the location table. So it knows it needs to scan through all the records in the location table. When it is performing the scanning, it will make use of the column value. Let's say the expected column value here is 2, and it performs the scan on the location table. This one is the savings AC. So here we are talking about the database, or let's state this is the entity itself, location account, and in the background it will load the content from savings AC. So for now it loaded ID. So ID is the search field given. It loaded the specific columns, that means a person name and balance, and through the submit form, or when it is loading the record, once it sees location ID column that contains value 2, it won't load 2 here. Instead, based on this type and the persistent unit managed entities, it scans the location table. Why? Because it knows that location entity is pointing to the location table. Here it performs the scan on the DB table. So it will pick the record, it loads the entity with ID, location ID 2, then street 1 and city 1, say for example, or street 2, city 2. So the entity is loaded, right? Its reference will get stored here. So that's what here we are specifying, location LOC, and LOC is now holding the instance of the loaded location. Let's say the instance is location 1 or location 2 of type location. So you see how it works. This is a join column. That's all we need to specify for the savings account entity to establish the relation. And this relation is one-to-one because unidirectional in the sense from savings account we can reach to location, but from location we cannot reach to this saving account. Why? Because here in this tutorial we are not going to code that, but towards the end of the sub-series we will tell how to do that. Alright, in case of bidirectional one-to-one, alright, in terms of bidirectional one-to-one, the non-owning entity should use the mapped by element, so that we will see as part of or in the part 8 video. So we will go into detail later for this bidirectional. Note, location ID is not marked as column. So since it is not marked as column, it won't load whatever is there in the database savings account to N1. I'm just talking about this particular record, 1000, and database column value here is 2, pointing to the location entity. Pointing to the location table with value 2. Since we doesn't specify it as a column, it won't load that value 2 here. So that's why here we want to you to note, location is not marked as column, but it was marked here as a join column. That means it performs scan and loads that entity and makes the containment inside the savings account. Right? We mark it with the join column, meaning that it points to ID of some other JPA entity. Some other JPA entity in the sense here it is location based on this type. So there are other piece of code here. So in the previous slide we just talked about the one-to-one annotation, and these are all our existing code. If you see code snippet 3, this one denotes the sub-series number 3, code snippet 1 and 2. So as part of sub-series 3 we added all these code snippet in sequential order. We specified savings account, then we marked its columns with a column annotation. Here comes one-to-one. This we saw in detail in the previous slide, so we will skip it. And by this time, you know, the location ID column here, location ID column here maps to ID of the location. So that's what happens in the background in the sense and the DB level. So here we generate getter and setter for this location. So this is the new field we added, right? We may be having the getter and setter for this balance, pname and PID. Since we are introducing this new field for the savings account, new field in the sense new mapped field, we specify getter and setter for this new field. Now we are overriding toString for our savings account as well. So as part of this subseries 7 code snippet 6, we are adding the toString. Here if you see, we specify pname. Pname means the person name in the database, or pname field here in the entity, and then we provide a square bracket. Inside that we specify the PID, then we are closing it, then there is a hyphen. After that we specify the balance. So for example, if pname is name, the output will be name, then PID set to hyphen balance. So this is how we will print the savings account when the savings account instance is appended to a string. That's all. Now we will go to Eclipse and do our demo. That means we will take the savings account and we will add the joining annotation. So here we loaded the Eclipse and the projects. We will go to JavaEE. Previously we added location entity, right? Here we added location entity. In this demo we will add a field for location ID, and in the previous video we doesn't started our server. So first we will start our server and see is there any error. So now we will add our project EJB JPA, which contains bean client, web project and entity project. So this JPA savings account is the entity project. Now it contains a new entity, so that's why we want to check whether loading is going smooth. Okay, here we are seeing deployed. Saving account bean is loaded. So let's go to savings account entity, and here we will add our joining strategy. Before that, we will switch to database development. We will connect to SQL Server. So okay, connected. Now we will switch back to JavaEE savings account, JPA savings account. That means we will open the properties of entity project. And here, see, this time it is showing SQL SRV Vault. We already connected to that, but the Eclipse ID is not refreshing it. For that, you can switch to some other entry in the connection, then pick it again so that it will get refreshed, and you are seeing it got connected. So let's apply it and click OK. So if we make any mistake, the Eclipse ID environment will report that to us. Alright, so now we will add the annotation OneToOne CascadeType all, join column location ID and location. So now let us switch back and verify the join. Here you are seeing LOC, right? PID is the key for the savings account. Here you are seeing this as a key column or ID column. Here is the location, and you can see how it get displayed here. It's a join field. So in the JPA detail view, you can see OneToOne, that's the relation type. So OneToOne relation, you are seeing a section target entity. If you see, it's the location entity. And here in the joining strategy, you can see LOC ID. LOC ID maps to our database column LOC. Savings AC column LOC ID. So that's what here it is specifying. So in the savings account entity, this LOC join column is LOC ID. So in the database it is LOC ID. Here also it is LOC ID, and this LOC ID maps to default ID. Default ID in the sense the target here is location. That means in the location entity, it points to the ID, thereby picking the whole record. Okay, now we will do getter and setter for our savings account. For that, here we are switching it to JavaEE perspective. Then we are picking the location data member, right clicking it here. Generate getter and setter. So let's pick both. Last member, okay, let it be. So that's all. Here we will place our comment, and we have getter and setter for our location. In the get method, if you see, it is returning location, and set method needs a location. That means the user of this entity will already create the location entity and give it to the savings account when they want to set the location. Next, we have to override the toString method. For that, under same JavaEE perspective, right click the savings account, then go to source, override and implement methods, pick toString, click OK. So that's all, our toString method is ready now. So we completed both the entities at this moment. So if you see, as a quick review, we added a mapping field here in the savings account entity. Then we provided a getter and a setter. After that, we did a toString override. So this time we kept our EJB EAR in the running state and we made our modification. So if required, we can perform restart. So here we are seeing deployed EJB EAR project, and our EJB EAR project contains all other projects, and Eclipse is, the wildfly is started. Here we are seeing both are synchronized. Alright, that means everything is okay. Okay, no error marks. Let's remove this. This will perform the or you can even go for stop. So undeployed. Now we will remove this. Then we will stop our wildfly server. So that's all here in this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.